Hey, everybody. I'm Ana Zangroniz, and I'm the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent in Miami-Dade County, working for the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service. And I'm happy to join you to talk about living shorelines and a little bit about coastal ecosystems and how they're playing a role in the future of our state. Looking forward to talking with you, hopefully again in the future. Should I be sharing my screen now? Fantastic. All right, everyone, you should be seeing on your screen my landing slide, which is called An Introduction to Living Shorelines in Florida. And we're going to be going over exactly what living shorelines are and what they do and how they're being implemented around the state. And first, I wanted to start out with defining what is a living shoreline. And according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, a living shoreline is a shoreline management practice that provides coastal erosion control benefits, protects, restores, or enhances natural shoreline habitat, and maintains coastal processes through a strategic placement of plants, stone, sandfill, and other structural organic materials. In other words, natural vegetation, natural objects, along with some man-made ones. And it's important to understand why we need living shorelines or why they're being used. And so to try and give you a good understanding of that type of context, I wanted to show you first a few historical photos. And I'm focusing on Miami-Dade County simply because that's where I'm based and that's where I'm most familiar, but I'm sure you can find photographs for your region, wherever you live or wherever you're from, by doing a little internet research. This photograph that's on the screen is a view on South Beach, and it's looking from the foot of the 18th Street Lifeguard Tower. So we're looking south, the ocean is on the left, the land is on the right, and this is a very different picture than what most of us think of now as Miami Beach or South Beach. It's a very built up, very hardened environment, and the reality is that all of Miami Beach historically was a mangrove swamp. And you can see in the photograph just how high the levels of vegetation are. And this is just over 100 years ago compared to what it looks like now. I also really like these photographs, which show two different views of different areas of Miami. If you look on the left, we first have Coconut Grove and Dinner Key. And you can see that the transitional areas between land and sea are very gradual versus the photo on the bottom, which shows this area in a more closer to present day. And you can see that the shoreline has been what we like to call hardened. In other words, hardened structures like jetties and piers and seawalls that are creating that definite stoppage of interaction between the water and the land. Over on the right, we have a historical aerial view of the Miami River, followed by how the Miami River looks currently. And it's pretty clear to see just how much urbanization and coastal development have really played a heavy role in developing our coastlines. And so now, 60 to 70 years after a lot of this development has happened, a lot of these features like seawalls are starting to get weaker and either need to be upgraded or replaced or done away with altogether. And so that's where living shorelines come into play. And we're going to talk about a few different kinds of living shorelines. A lot of these approaches are often, you'll see at least two of them or three of them implemented all together. And the first that we're going to look at I'm going to briefly mention, but we're not going to cover it so much today, but is the salt marsh. And coastal salt marshes have pretty much completely been eliminated in Miami-Dade County, but a salt marsh can be thought of as an area between the beach and the open ocean. Next, we have mangrove forests, which sit right on the intertidal zone where the edge of land and sea meets. We have oyster reefs, which are in shallow waters just offshore. And then finally, last but not least, we have coral reefs, which aren't so much a living shoreline, but a marine ecosystem that is vital to South Florida protection. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I do want to mention that when thinking about living shorelines, it's important to understand that not all living shorelines are created equal. And what I mean by that is based upon what was there before, or based upon the conditions that make it favorable for certain types of habitats, you can't just put any type of habitat in any part of the state. And what you're seeing on the map right now is the range of where mangroves are found in Florida. And starting on the east coast, you can see that their northernmost extent is the Ponce de Leon Inlet, which is up by St. Augustine, all the way down the Atlantic coast, all the way throughout the Keys, up the Gulf Coast. And the greatest mangrove populations that we have are in the 10,000 Islands region. And you'll see we have a couple of rogue mangroves here in the Panhandle, and we've had a couple of pop-ups of these black mangroves that have made it north due to their expanding their thermal tolerance range and made it up to the Panhandle. We also have oysters, and when I say oysters, I'm talking about reef building, the eastern oyster. We have them almost around the entire state with the exception of southeast and some parts of southwest Florida. So if Miami-Dade County wanted to try and employ oyster restoration, it wouldn't really be successful because the conditions don't exist here anymore. The waters are too warm and too saline. They're just too salty to support oysters. And then last but not least, we have the coral reef of Florida, which starts out at the Dry Tortugas, which is about 70 miles from Key West, and continues north through 5 counties, stopping at the St. Lucie Inlet in Martin County. So thinking back to where these ecosystems and approaches can exist, a coral reef restoration approach wouldn't likely be a reasonable alternative for, say, the Panhandle of Florida. And the benefits to living shorelines, there are many, both from an economic perspective and an ecological or environmental perspective. I've put a bunch of these reasons on the board, and I'll highlight a few. They do provide stability to the shoreline, and in doing this, they also do this because they help attenuate waves or lessen the impact of wave energy and reduce wave height. They provide habitat for fish, invertebrates, and birds, and with that comes a major increase in biodiversity, which is pretty cool. They help shore up our shorelines. They help strengthen our shorelines in the face of large storm events. They are more cost effective than what we think of as gray or hardened features like seawalls. And my favorite part, just from an aesthetic perspective, is that they're pretty. They're really beautiful and pleasing to look at and provide a nice atmosphere and ambiance to spend time in and around. We're going to look a little bit more closely at 3 of these habitats or living shorelines components. And we're going to start with starting far off the shore with the coral reefs and then work our way in towards land. Coral reefs provide the first line of defense for more than 63 million people around the world. They take up just 1% of the ocean floor, but are home to about 25% of marine fish species, which is really important when you think about coral reefs as a house or a place for food sources. And Florida's coral reef is one of the largest barrier reefs in the world and is about 300 miles from tip to tip. It's pretty impressive, and it supports a ton of biodiversity and economic activity throughout Southeast Florida. From a coastal resilience standpoint, when I mentioned that coral reefs are the first line of defense, we're talking a natural barrier from major storm action. And of course, in Florida, most of the time when we're referring to storms, we're thinking hurricanes. And I really like this cross section here of the reef because number one, it shows just how interconnected the different coastal habitats really are. And it shows how that reef, if you look over here all the way on the right, how that reef and reef height is vital to providing that first breakwater, that first barrier to help break down and slow down wave energy before it gets to the shore. And a healthy, functioning, intact reef system can reduce wave energy by about 97%, which is pretty incredible. And so one thing I'd like to bring up, I've been asked before, you know, should we have coral reefs instead of seawalls or seawalls instead of coral reefs? And they're not mutually exclusive. In other words, one does not replace the other. Coral reefs are really important and we need them in the ocean offshore to start slowing down those forces before they reach where we live. And seawalls, in some places where seawalls have already been built, I hate to say it, but it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to do away with them completely, depending on the surrounding environment that has them. So the major point about seawalls that might change as we move forward is that seawalls might then be integrated with vegetation and other types of living shorelines to be a more softer and natural approach than just the gray hard-edged wall. As we move inward, we have oyster reefs. And oyster reefs save communities about $85,000 per hectare per year instead of using an artificial breakwater or that man-made engineered structure to slow down wave action. And in addition to serving as that buffer zone of tidal energy and boat energy, filter feeding oysters improve water quality because they're able to filter, one oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water. And my head just flew off my body. I apologize. I'll get back to it in a second. But these structures are really important. And because oysters are functionally extinct, meaning that the natural oyster reef systems that we had historically, they have been destroyed due to man-made threats, diseases and parasites, etc., that it's really important that these are now restored. And so oysters that are served in restaurants, those are products from farmed oysters or aquaculture. And the oysters that are being restored with that specific purpose of creating a reef to serve all of those ecosystem benefits that we've been talking about. It's back. One oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day on a functioning reef. And so in addition to mitigating wave action, thinking about all those oysters, doing their jobs, what they do naturally, and improving water quality, which is something that's super important to us throughout Florida. As people come to Florida, they want to see clean, beautiful, clear water. And oyster restoration has largely been taking place through lots of community-based initiatives, and namely oyster shell recycling. And what that involves is the collection of oyster shell that's served either at restaurants or when people purchase them to eat at home. And the shell is then taken back and transported to a specific location. And this nifty little graphic gives you an idea of what takes place in the oyster recycling process. The shells are collected, and then moving over to the right, those shells are kept dried in the sun and cured for about 3 to 6 months before they're bagged up and then outplanted to a very specific reef area. Then eventually, more oysters are sold and consumed, and the process continues. And this has been a really great opportunity for citizen science and community involvement in preparing the oysters and deploying the reefs and monitoring the reefs. Last but not least, I wanted to touch upon mangroves, which are another one of my favorite habitats. And these are the trees that are salt tolerant and can be found living in water. They're specifically adapted to do so. And this infographic is really nifty because it shows this is just a handful representation of the different species that are dependent upon mangroves for certain parts, if not all of their life cycle. And mangroves in and of themselves, their really complex root structure help reduce wave height 66%. So thinking about the coral reefs offshore, if there are oysters, and then by the time those waves get to shore, the mangroves help reduce the wave height even more, which is pretty fantastic. And they're really cool places to look at birds, kayak, paddle around in, photograph in, and even snorkel. And whatever the type of restoration project is chosen, it's important that you examine all of what was there before. Like I mentioned in the beginning, you can't just put one type of habitat in one place or one type of habitat in the other. It's important to look at what was in the area historically, what's there now, what the local environmental conditions are currently, and whether they'll support the success of those habitats. And with mangrove restoration, it's actually, I don't want to say it's easier, it has its own set of challenges, but mangrove propagules, which are the seeds, can actually be collected, and you could keep one on a jar on your desk and then go plant it somewhere. The key to that is once it's planted and rooted in the ground, it's protected by a Florida state law. So those nurseries, like this photograph that's shown here on your screen, have reared propagules into small trees to then be transplanted or outplanted to a site. And that is done under a regulatory process that, again, is regulated by the state of Florida. And to give you an idea, this is a site that was restored in Southwest Florida. And the photograph on the left shows these PVC pipes, and those are often placed into the substrate to help give support to that propagule until it can really establish its roots and grow to the point where it's flourishing. And all of these projects have very important and strict monitoring requirements for certain intervals, for certain periods of time to determine their success. And so I really do like this photo because you can still see one of the PVC pipes on the right to see that it's the same area. And when we have this larger conversation, there's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and that's this term called resilience. And that simply refers to the ability to bounce back or to return from some sort of stress or event. And this diagram, I apologize that it's a little fuzzy, was put together by the Nature Conservancy in a study that they did, showing that here in the top, this is depicting a healthy coral reef system and how when waves hit it, that healthy coral reef system substantially slows down and shrinks that wave movement. Versus if the health of the reef height is minimized by as little as 3 feet, 1 meter, you have substantially more wave movement and subsequent damage on shore. And so that's where all of these different components of living shorelines really come into play. And if you're not sold yet, the proof is in the pudding. These are photographs from after Hurricane Irma, which hit the lower Florida Keys in 2017. And I want to direct your attention to the arrow on the left. This is showing an arrow where there were no mangroves, and this section of US 1 suffered erosion. Versus the arrow on the right had mangroves in front of it, and therefore didn't have much damage. The damage was minimal compared to the other spot that was just to the south. And one more example of this, again, is this section of US 1, which might I add is the only way in and out of the Florida Keys if you've never been. So only one choice when traveling there. There was damage to the roadbed because there wasn't an intact beach and dune system to block the road. Versus just here, just south on the road, that part of the area of US 1 was kept much more intact. And I'm going to leave you all with one last thing. This is a wave model tank that my colleague built to simulate wave action from a storm. And this area here, this is the shoreline, and this is imagining a seawall. So there's nothing in front of the properties, in front of the homes, just a seawall. And if you watch, This little area is draining to a cup. So I think it ends up with somewhere around 500 milliliters of water. I don't want to fast forward it because I don't want to miss the good stuff, but just keep an eye on where this fill level goes. And that was imagining, again, waves from a major storm washing up and either scouring the seawall or just bypassing the seawall. And this is simulating the flooding that's happening. Oh, I was wrong. It's closer to 800 milliliters. And then if you keep your eye on the wave tank, the staff member has placed in a bag of oyster shell. And might I say that this is not to scale, but this oyster bag, this can be representative of an oyster reef. It can also be representative, if you're in Southeast Florida, of a coral reef. And just watch as this overflow thing catches it. You'll be able to see that the amount of washover or simulated flooding is substantially less than in the first experiment. Again, not to scale, but simply designed to give you an idea of how these natural systems, these living shorelines, the marine habitat of a coral reef, can really improve what happens for us on land. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much for listening and hanging in there. And I encourage you to please reach out to me through email and follow my program on Facebook or Instagram. And I'm happy to talk marine habitats, living shorelines, and how you can get involved in your local community. Thank you very much.